As an introduction, being an Iraqi in a predominantly Ashkenazi synagogue here, it's a topic that often comes up. It's very pertinent to myself and to a lot of my friends, that we talk about Ashkenazim and Sephardim, but even I myself, I feel that I don't really know what that actually means and the origins of these two words, and really, where do we all fit in the greater picture of Judaism, and where do we all fit in the greater oneness of Judaism? So I'm very honored to introduce Professor Ira Robinson, who has been a professor at Concordia University in the Department of Religious Studies for 35 years, and he will help clarify for us the history, the original migrations of the Jewish people, and really set out the definitions of what Ashkenazim and what Sephardim really are. I invite you to enjoy it and then to come enjoy the further lectures that will further enlighten us on the topics. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. In honor of the topic, I am going to begin in Yiddish. That's the Ashkenazic side, as you'll find out. But when two Yiddishophones get together, one of the first things that is often said is, "Von wannen bist du Yid?" Where do you come from as a Jew? So, the topic of this lecture is, "Von wannen bist du Yid?" And we will get it very interestingly unpacked in the next 40 minutes or so, and there will be time for many questions, and there will be many more questions probably than I have answers. Because if it's a really good question, there usually isn't a really good answer, particularly in this topic. Where are you from? Von wannen bist du Yid? Well, if you asked a Jew on the street 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or possibly even 5 minutes ago, where do you come from? The answer you would get historically, and probably still among many Jews in contemporary times, is, well, we go back to the people we read about in the Bible. There's Abraham and Sarah. There's Yitzchak and Rivka. There's Yaakov and his wives. And there's a people. And there's Mitzrayim. And there's Sinai. And there's the Promised Land. And there's a whole history. So, if you were to ask somebody, who are your ancestors? Certainly 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, but probably even now, many of the people who consider themselves Jews would say, well, we go way, 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 way back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that is a statement that is so profoundly true for Jews, historically and even contemporaneously, that it is true even when it is not. What do I mean? Because Jews are Jews, because they're born Jewish, and Jews are Jews because they choose to be Jewish. They convert to Judaism. they become what Jews call gerei tzedek, righteous converts, righteous proselytes. In the Middle Ages, in the 12th century, one of them, his name was Ovadia. And he was a Christian cleric in Italy, convinced of the truth of Judaism, converted to Judaism despite the fact that for medieval Christians, conversion of a Christian to Judaism was a capital offense. So he did the right thing. He took the first boat out of Italy and went to Egypt where nobody knew him. And there he went to the greatest rabbi of Egypt in that time, and arguably in most other times, Rabbi Moses ben Maimonides, the Rambam. And he said, I got a problem. What's my problem? What's your problem? Well, as a Jew, I have to pray several times daily. And the major prayer, the Amidah, starts like this. Blessed are you, O God, God of our fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. Do I say this? Can I say this? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob weren't my ancestors. And the Rambam answered him and said, that's not true. That's absolutely not true. It may be in sort of a physical, genealogical sense, they are not your ancestors, but Abraham's job was to create a community of believers. And you are part now of that community of believers. And so, therefore, you can and you must, with every other Jew, say in your prayer, God of our fathers, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it gets quite complex because Jews understand themselves to be a people descended from a line of people. And of course, they're not everybody anyway, because it is equally clear that Jews are people who come to believe one way or another, in one sense or another, that they are of the community of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And now to the topic. The topic is Ashkenazim and Sephardim. Once again, von wannen bist du hier? Where do you come from? And in contemporary times, to be sure, when you ask most Jews, they will often, not invariably, but often answer one or the other. So, but to get to the origins of what it means to be Ashkenazic, what it means to be Sephardic, we have to go back almost 2,000 years and understand, or begin to understand, the Jewish world as it existed 2,000 years ago, as it changed, as it developed, and, well, 2,000 years ago, roughly speaking, and what's a few hundred years among friends? 2,000 years ago, more or less, Jews, people who thought of themselves as Jews, people who were looked upon by others as Jews, were largely, though never exclusively, concentrated on the eastern end of the Mediterranean in a territory known as Judea, the land of the Jews. And, well, if you're a Judean in Judea, well, there are many things that will still differentiate you. You will be differentiated by social class, but you will also, of course, be differentiated by the way in which you understand the demands of the Torah. Are you a Pharisee? Who believes in the power of ancestral tradition? Are you a Sadducee, somebody who says, well, if it's written black on white in the Torah, I'm going to go for it, and if it isn't, I may be doubtful? Are you an Essene who says the plague on both of your houses? There are many different people who are, who are contending for what was really the very important goal of understanding what does God want from me? What does the Torah tell me to do? How am I supposed to organize my life? Well, once again, we're not talking at all about Ashkenazim, we're not talking about Sephardim, but we are talking about different people with different ideas, different philosophies. In the aftermath of the destruction of Judea by the Romans, in the aftermath of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE, in the aftermath of the destruction of the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century CE, Jews are largely eliminated from Judea, and the Romans are so PO'd at the Jews that they decide to change the name of the country from Judea, the country of the Jews, to Palestina. Jews, nonetheless, are still living in the land of Israel. This is one of their strongholds still. Mostly up north, but still in some areas of Judea as well. But also to the east in Iraq, in what we will in contemporary times call Iraq, but was called at that time Bavel, Babylonia, by the Jews. In these two areas, the land of Israel on the one hand, Bavel, Babylonia on the other, there arose two parallel Judaic civilizations. Civilizations that had much in common, but also much to divide them. They had in common the Hebrew Bible, Tanakh. They had in common, by the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, they had the Mishnah, the first basic rabbinic document. And they also possessed rabbinic academies, places where Torah was studied, places where the teachings of the ancient rabbis of the Mishnah were discussed, were argued over, were expanded upon. But they were all, for all they had in common, and probably because they had so much in common, and also because they were Jews, they argued. If you know nothing else about Judaism, you will know that people argue. There's very seldom one Jewish point of view. And in ancient times, no less than in contemporary times, there is no such thing as a Jewish view. I always like to say, this is Judaism, here's the other side. So, in the land of Israel, as Jews studied and interpreted and argued and attempted to understand, and in Babylonia, as Jews attempted to study and argue and understand and develop their ideas, there grew to be both differences, because after all, we're talking about different people, different circles, different ideas, sometimes different conclusions. And there was also a rivalry. There used to be a story, there used to be a saying, does Macy's tell Gimbels? That was before Gimbels went belly up, of course, but okay. Does Macy's tell Nordstrom's? Whatever. The people in Bavel thought, we're the guys. We're the ones. We got the brains, we got the knowledge, we got the everything. The people in Eretz Yisrael were where we're supposed to be, in the land of Israel. How about you guys? Where are you? And, of course, there were people who were coming in between, going in between, and telling the people in Eretz Yisrael what the guys in Bavel were about, and telling the guys in Bavel what the people in Eretz Yisrael were about. In the Gemara, very often you get the phrase, Ki ata Rav Dimi. Rav Dimi was always arriving. He was an arrivist. And once again, the people in Eretz Yisrael thought they knew, the people in Babel thought they knew, and sometimes they said rather sharp things, hurling arguments at each other, and that makes the study of the Talmud, or one of the things that makes the study of the Talmud so interesting. But let me get back to the topic. So, there are different centers of ancient Jewish life. And, of course, there are Jews attested in many other countries, in Egypt, in Rome. But in terms of rabbinic Judaism, in terms of the Judaism that historically developed and that had its continuity in medieval and modern times, in terms of the rabbinic culture that had its continuity in medieval and modern times, those are the two centers. Now, let's scroll forward a few hundred years. And what happens in a few hundred years is Islam. 7th century. The Prophet Muhammad creates a religious and political community in the Arabian Peninsula, and after Muhammad's death, it explodes outside of that peninsula, and within a mere few decades, and by the speed of early medieval times, in lightning speed, Islam controls the Middle East, North Africa, Persia, Spain, comes within an ace of getting France, and if you know the Chanson de Roland expresses the idea that, well, but for a few of those brave Christian warriors, Islam would be, well, but it wasn't. The world of the early Middle Ages was divided, and divided between Christian countries, countries that were controlled by Christians, and where the dominant religious expression was Christianity, one sort or another. And there's Catholic Christianity, there's Orthodox Christianity, there's all kinds of different interpretations that we don't have time to get on to. But there are Christian countries, and there are, of course, Muslim countries. And that's where the story of Ashkenaz and Sepharad really begins in earnest. Though once again, you don't have a fully blown Ashkenaz and Sepharad for many centuries onward, but nonetheless, at its basis, because by the 8th century, 7th, 8th century CE, the world of the Mediterranean is divided between Christian and Muslim countries, with conflict between them, and trade, and intellectual interchange. All of these things are going on at the same time, but there are Jews who are found in both areas. At the very beginning of the Middle Ages, however, mostly Jews are found in Muslim countries. The two great centers of rabbinic culture in Eretz Yisrael and in Babel, they're both within the Islamic Caliphate. And that's where something very interesting happens. One of the caliphs, one of Muhammad's successors, political and religious, decided to create a new capital in a small village called Baghdad. It was a small village, but not for long. It became the capital of an empire, as I said, that stretched from the Pyrenees in the west practically to the Indus in the east. And it was an empire that, for the standards of the time, worked and worked very well. It created some of the great intellectual, well, there's much to say, but I'm going to have to concentrate on the Jews for a moment. What happened when the empire, the Islamic empire, centralized on Baghdad is that the Jews went and centralized their institutions. In Babylonia, there were two great yeshivot, two great rabbinic academies, Sura and Naharda'ah. But very soon after the capital was centralized, they moved to Baghdad because they needed to be where the action was. And the fact is that the Jewish community of Baghdad became the central community in the empire. And you know what? The rabbinic interpretations of the Babylonian Talmud become standard because of the rise of the Islamic Caliphate. Why should, there are rabbinic academies in Babylonia. There are rabbinic academies in the land of Israel. Why should the Babylonian Talmud be the one that Jews historically have studied? For every 100 Jews who study the Babylonian Talmud seriously, there may be 2.5 who study the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael with equal seriousness. The Babylonian Talmud becomes standard. Well, it's not because the Jews of Eretz Yisrael said, well, okay, yeah, we give up, you can have, let's all agree. They didn't agree. They didn't like it in the least. They fought it. And they lost. So now, we have to, okay, so there are many things to understand about differences in early medieval Jewish society. And one of the important things is that in terms of influence, there are two major centers. Babylonia, the land of Israel, thank you, Michelle, and, well, now things start to get interesting. Now things start to get interesting because as Jews, one of the important things, one of the really crucially important things that happens in the early medieval period is that the heads of the great rabbinic academies, the yeshivot, begin to spread their teachings in writing and create liaisons, create connections with Jewish communities in North Africa, in Spain, elsewhere. And all of these connections, all of these intellectual connections, help further the standardization of the Babylonian Talmud as the Talmud. But now, by the High Middle Ages, still, there are a lot of Jews in Islam, but there are getting to be more and more and more Jews who are living in Christian countries. And there are different kinds of Jews living in different kinds of Christian countries. In the East, where Orthodox Christianity is dominant, where in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, in Greece and elsewhere, the Roman Empire still has not died. It's a place that we know as the Byzantine Empire, but they thought of themselves as the continuation of the Romans. And the Arabs, when they referred to this territory geographically, they called it Al-Rum, Rome. There was a very interesting and vibrant Jewish community that called itself Romaniot. The Jewish community of, the Roman Jewish community, Romaniot. And there are still, to this day, remnants of a Romaniot community in Turkey, in North America, elsewhere, but fairly small. But in the Middle Ages, in the early Middle Ages in particular, Romaniot Jews were Greek-speaking. And they got their Bible translated into Greek. The Jews in Muslim countries were Arabic-speaking. And ultimately, they got their Bible translated into Arabic. And Saadia Gaon is the one who had created the Arabic translation, the tafsir of the Torah that Judeo-Arab, Jews in Islam still can use. But in Western Europe, where do Jews come from? How do Jews get to Western Europe? Well, we know very little about the most early times. We do know from archaeological evidence and a bit more that there were Jews living in Northern Europe, in a place like Cologne in Germany, even in Roman times. We don't know what kind of continuity there was, but we begin getting evidence of continuity starting around the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries. And what we find is that as trade develops in Northern Europe in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, in places like, well, what we would call geographically today France or Germany, Jews become some of the more prominent traders. And Jewish communities develop along the major trade routes of Northern Europe, which happen usually to be river routes, because rivers are very good for carrying goods and peoples. And so, for instance, along the River Rhine, you get numerous Jewish communities. Where do they come? You know, communities in Worms, Mainz, Speyer. And we know actually of the origins of some of these communities, particularly Speyer. Speyer was a community, a city, a small town, that was ruled by its bishop. And the bishop issued a document saying, you know, we want to develop our city. We want to develop our commerce. We need Jews. And they got them. Jews, in other words, were part of a developing community's infrastructure. You wanted trade, you wanted Jews. You wanted economic development, you wanted Jews. Where do these Jews come from? These Jews come from, well, in the first instance, they come from Italy. They come more specifically from southern Italy, which at that time, you know, 7th, 8th, 9th century, is ruled by the Byzantine Empire. And it is called in Hebrew sources of the time, Italia shel Yavan. You know, and you wonder, what does it mean? Greek Italy. Byzantine ruled Italy, Italia shel Yavan. This is, and there are great Jewish communities there, where in places where there are practically no Jewish communities now. But there was a saying, there was a text, Ki mi bari tetze Torah udvar Hashem mi otranto. From Bari shall come forth the Torah and the word of Hashem from Otranto. Look them up in Annapolis. Yosef, you look it up in here. From Italy, you go across the Alps and into these river trading routes. And the communities of Jews are created. And these communities of Jews in France, in Germany, once again talking about modern geographical concepts, these Jews are, well, they share many things with the Jews of Islam. Many things, but not all things. Here's one of the things they share. The Babylonian Talmud. From the earliest times that we can trace the intellectual history of Jews in Northern Europe, they are studying the Babylonian Talmud and doing it quite well. They are in the business of creating study aids. What kind of study aids do you need to study anything, especially in a language that is foreign to you? You need a dictionary. They got one. It was a book called the Aruch, written by Rabbi Natan of Rome, which explains all the hard words in the Talmud. And if you remember nothing else from this lecture, here's what you're going to remember. Rabbi Natan of Rome is explaining in the vernacular, in his Italian vernacular, a certain kind of flatbread that's mentioned in the Talmud, and he says, in the vernacular it's called pizza. And this happens to be the very, very first mention of the word pizza in any document. Jews got there first. Oh. So they created study aids like dictionaries. Ultimately, by the 11th century, you get somebody like Rashi who is creating a commentary that takes people by the hand and says, I know you don't understand this, but wait a minute, it's going to be explained a little later on. Or, you don't know this word? Well, the equivalent in our language is, you know, and he does this for the Torah. Mar'ot is a word that is expressed in the Torah. You look at Rashi, says miroir. Once again, it's important to understand that the Jews in Christian Europe by the 10th, 11th, certainly the 12th, 13th century, we're talking about a very culturally creative community. A community that is centered on the study of Tanakh and of the Babylonian Talmud. But, and this community is becoming, you know, this Northern European Jewish community or series of Jewish communities is, in a certain sense, marginal to the much larger Jewish communities within Islamic countries. But these Jewish communities are acquiring a name for themselves. When Maimonides, sitting in Egypt, is giving a kind of a world view, and he says, in our country, Talmud study is going way down. Very few people can really understand it. Not in Bavel, not in Egypt. He said, but I heard tell that in Christian Europe there are people who are doing interesting things. You know, it's a distant rumor, but it's a very true rumor. So, once again, you have a world divided between Islam and Christendom, and you have Jewish communities within Islam and within Christendom. And they share the heritage of Rabbinic Judaism, to be sure. But they're very different in many ways. But one of the most important differences is language. Language is very, very important for any community. And the fact is that within a few decades of the Islamic conquests, Jews in Islamic countries are speaking Arabic. They're speaking Arabic, and because they are able to speak and understand Arabic, they have easy access to everything written in Arabic. Because if you're a halfway intelligent person, it's not a big deal to learn a new alphabet. If you know the language anyway, you can learn the alphabet in an hour or two, or maybe even less. And because you know the language, and because you can easily learn the Arabic alphabet, what you have available to you in the very early Middle Ages is the top philosophical and scientific knowledge then available. Because the caliphs, among the many things they did, they encouraged the translation of scientific and philosophical and mathematical texts from Greek to Arabic. And what that meant is that Jews who have an intellectual bent, they had access to the latest, up-to-date science, philosophy, math, you name it. And this was both a problem and an opportunity. It was a problem because, well, you have to, because science and philosophy did not always and inevitably say exactly the same thing as the Judaic tradition had been saying. And therefore you got a series of great Jews, like Saadia Gaon, like Maimonides, like others, who attempted to the best of their ability to figure out, well, what does it all mean? How can we deal with the truth of Torah in terms of the truth of science and philosophy? Are they the same? Are they opposed? If they're opposed, how do we choose? Arabic becomes the language of Jewish philosophy because Arabic had developed a scientific, a technical vocabulary, and it was used not merely for science and technology and math. Arabic also became used for, it became used for rabbinic responsa. It became used for commentaries on the Mishnah. It became used for books about Hebrew poetry. The greatest book about Hebrew poetry that comes out of the Middle Ages is Moses ibn Ezra's Kitab al-Mukhadra al-Mudakhra. Because Arabic is what you use. You know, you pray in Hebrew, you study the Torah in Hebrew, you study the Gemara in Aramaic, but you explain it in Arabic, because that's how things work. Now, in Christian Europe, Jews are in a very different place and in a very different position, because in Christian Europe, in Islam, Arabic is the language of everyday speech, and of course, there are different dialects of Arabic, and if you are tuned to it, you can tell, well, in contemporary times, you can tell after a couple of sentences, is this Arabic speaker an Iraqi, a Palestinian, an Egyptian, a Moroccan? It's very easy to do if you're into it. In other words, of course, it's all Arabic, but But the fact is that as a literary language, it's very much the same. So good, they can access it easy. But because they know, they know the language, they can access the science and technology that's in the same language. But in Christian Europe, the language of science and technology and philosophy and mathematics and whatever else we're talking about is Latin. And Latin is a specialized language. Latin is not the language that people on the street use. When Rashi wants to explain marot, he uses miroir, because that's the vernacular language he used. He used medieval French. Rabbi Nathan of Rome used medieval Italian, the Roman dialect. When, and therefore, by and large, Jews don't learn Latin, with certain exceptions, but by and large, they go with the vernacular, and Christian scholarship goes with Latin. And on those few occasions when Jewish and Christian scholars get together for friendly or unfriendly discussions, depending, they have, these discussions take place in the vernacular, not in Latin. So now, this means something very important. It means that Jews in Christian Europe are not, certainly not initially, they're not attuned in the same way to science or to philosophy or to mathematics or to technology as Jewish intellectuals in Islamic countries like Iraq or Egypt or Tunisia or wherever we're talking about. They nonetheless, just as Maimonides hears distantly that there are some really creative Talmudic scholars over there in France, people in France and Germany hear vaguely there are some very interesting philosophical texts being created among the Jews in Arabic countries. And they begin demanding to know what gives. And their demand creates one of the most important translation projects in the 13th century, by which the great Arabic works of medieval Jews, Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, Judah Halevi's Kuzari, Bachya ibn Pekuda's Duties of the Heart, they are all translated into Hebrew for the benefit of Jews who don't know Arabic in Christian Europe. So what that means is that by the 12th, 13th, 14th century, there is a there is a interchange, a growing interchange between two groups of people. Jews from an Arabic-speaking milieu, Jews from a Christian milieu, Jews whose native language is Arabic or Judeo-Arabic. Jews in Christian Europe are learning the texts translated into Hebrew, of course, that were created by Jews in Islamic countries. Before this, there was, for all the commonality, there were also rather important differences. And one of the more important differences, and one of the more interesting differences, is the power in Christian Europe of many of the ways of being Jewish that we saw originally in Eretz Yisrael. Custom of minhag was tremendously important. And it was so important that even if the Babylonian Talmud, which was standard as a study, as a textbook, both in Christian Europe and in the world of Islam, even when this custom goes counter or fits very dicily in with the rulings of the Babylonian Talmud, even so minhag in Christian Europe tends to win. Friday night, in most synagogues, there is kiddush. But the person who makes kiddush, the cantor, does not, as a rule, drink the kiddush wine or grape juice. Why? Because the Babylonian Talmud says there is no kiddush except where you eat. So what do? You rely on the presence of a young child in the congregation, and you give the child the drink, and therefore it's not a bracha lebatala, it's not a blessing in vain. If you read the paragraph in the standard Judaic codes of law about why and how and everything, there's a lot of ins and outs and convolutions, because there is a minhag, there is a custom. And this custom is so strong that even if there is a clear ruling that says you don't do it, you do it. And scholars have traced many of these customs that are distinctive to Jews in Christian Europe, to ancient Eretz Yisrael. So now, there are many differences between Jews in Christian Europe and Jews in the world of Islam, but we're still not at Ashkenaz and Sepharad. And I'm almost running out of time. And so I want to tell you that Ashkenaz and Sepharad come online not early, but late. and they come on, and they become codes for Jews deriving from the world of Islam on the one hand, and the world of Christendom, Western Christendom on the other hand. Ashkenaz is a word you'll find in the 10th chapter of Genesis. There's a, among all the nations, Ashkenaz is there. I forget which verse, but it's Genesis chapter 10. Go to your Tanakh and read a whole list, this, Ashkenaz. What does it mean? We don't exactly know where this place, Ashkenaz, described in Genesis 10 was. But medieval Jews thought Ashkenaz meant lands that we would describe as Germany or Germanic. And Ashkenazic Jews are Ashkenazic Jews because Ashkenaz Jews in Germany were the survivors. In Christian Europe, starting in the late 13th and into the 14th, 15th centuries, Jews were expelled from England in 1290. They were expelled from royal France in 1306, and then they got back a little bit. Then finally they were expelled in 1394. And from the 13th to the 14th to the 15th to the 16th century, Western Europe was becoming not a Jew-free area in many places, except in Germany, not because there weren't people who wanted to expel Jews from these Germanic lands as well. There darn well were. But providentially, one might say, Germany in the late medieval and early modern period was divided into literally hundreds of bishoprics and principalities and goodness knows what all. And you threw the Jews out of Frankfurt. There was a town nearby that would take them. German Jews were the survivors. French Jews, some of them moved to Germany. Some of them moved to Italy. And the surname Sarfati is, you can find it in Italy. You can find this name in Italy. You can trace refugee French Jews in Italy, in Germany, elsewhere. That community is a memory, becomes a memory. The community that created the Tosafists becomes a memory that is preserved by those Jews who remain in Germany. And therefore, by, providence, by historical accident, by whatever you want, we have a situation where there is a tradition of Talmudic learning. There is a tradition of prayer. There is a tradition of law and its study that has its continuity in the land that medieval Jews called Ashkenaz. From thence, Ashkenazim. Sephardim, well, Sepharad is a name of a place, and once again, it is mentioned in Tanakh, but it becomes known by medieval Jews to designate the Iberian Peninsula. Now, why is it that Sepharad represents the Jews of Islam? Well, this is a long story because, once again, just as Jews in Christian Europe are divided between people who speak Judeo-Italian, people who speak Judeo-French, and Judeo-German, etc., well, they are divided because, there are, Jews from Spain are not Jews from North Africa or Jews from the Middle East. But once again, because of the great expulsion from Spain in 1492, ultimately, the remnants of Spanish Jewry come to places like North Africa, come to places like Syria, come to places like Turkey, and in a very interesting exercise of cultural imperialism, they impose their learning, and not without sparks. In Morocco, for instance, the native Moroccan Jews, who were known as Toshavim, were clash with the exiles, the Magorashim. But once again, the Magorashim, those exiles from Spain, who thought they were really something, and indeed they were really something, but they managed to create or impose their name and their cultural achievements on all Jewry in the Islamic world, not without discomfort from local Jewries, not without sparks flying, but, well, once again, Ashkenazim and Sephardim. It's a concept. And there are 3 more lectures. Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you very much, Robinson, for that. And we look forward to more in-depth knowledge.